Welcome back to room 303 in Junior English. We now turn in your hymnals to 1216, 1217, the fourth and the final act of Arthur Miller's classic, The Crucible. However, before we get there, we want to give just a brief mini lecture to kind of bring us up to speed with where we are, introduce you or review a few ideas for you as well as we go forward. Now, in your junior year, we begin to introduce to you some ideas that will come back to us in our study at the senior level. On the dramatic side, a lot of that will have to do with A, Aristotle, and then B, these other texts that we are studying from our junior and our senior on. Here, it's Arthur Miller's play Crucible. Later, it will be Arthur Miller's play Death of the Salesman. Then it will be Eugene O'Neill's play Long Day's Journey into Night, a text we only watch. Then, in your senior year, it will be Shakespeare's play Macbeth, as well as Shakespeare's play Hamlet, and sometimes other Shakespeare plays as well in our senior year. So we want to put together some ideas on the whiteboard that are kind of review. Let's start first of all, I already mentioned them. Let's start first of all with Aristotle's Poetics, okay? So write that text down. Poetics. I mean, you can kind of see how that very word poetics and our word poetry are very similar, but we want to be careful with that word, because when Aristotle uses the word poetics, what he means is what we would call today drama. Okay, that's what we would call it. All right? What he's really talking about is simply the question, what makes great plays? We might, by extension today, might say, what makes great movies? Okay? He has several ideas that we will just summarize. Most importantly, he is going to argue that watching a play is a performance both of sociology and psychology. Now, he doesn't use these terms. What he says is that we come in and we sit and we watch the performance. We're sitting in the audience, they're the people up on stage. For example, there's John Proctor, there's Goody Proctor, there's Reverend Hale, there's Abigail Williams, right? We're watching those actors on stage do their gig. We have a tendency to feel like that the play is up on stage, happening. Arthur Miller wrote the lines. At the very conclusion of Act 3, John Proctor will scream, God is dead, and he screams it as the actor playing John Proctor. And we have this tendency to think, that's where the play is, that's where the drama is. And Aristotle says, not so fast. And this is what makes Aristotle and this text so important. Because he says, while we feel like the play is happening on stage, the real drama is happening in the audience. In the audience. That's where the real drama is happening. That's where the real action is happening. Why? Because Aristotle said there's this thing called the protagonist. Now we want to write that term down. We've heard these terms. Of course, the opposite of the protagonist is the antagonist, no question. The protagonist. Now, pro means in favor of. Okay? Protagonist. This is the character, let's define it, with whom the audience most identifies. Now, this word identifies is a key word. All right? What does that mean? To identify with a character. No, it does not mean in our 7th grade simplistic language that we like that character. Although, we will say that the protagonist is one to whom we're kind of drawn, no question. But there's something else way more profound going on for Aristotle. Aristotle says that what happens is we have to watch the fall, the tragic fall of the protagonist. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean he walks across the stage and he trips? Not physically. Yes, emotionally, spiritually, but not physically. Well, then what does it mean? It means the following. We come in, we sit down. We watch John Proctor. In the first exchanges with John Proctor on stage, we go, this guy's been messing around with a young girl. He is married. He has kids. Whoa. And then, his wife knows. And then, Oh, he doesn't want anybody else to know. Right? Then, all of a sudden, all this crazy starts happening in Salem. Witchcraft, people flying over places, and people coming into bedrooms without being seen, and all this other kind of garbage is going on. And we're like, well, this is insanity. Why doesn't John Proctor just pull the plug on the whole project? That's what his wife tells him to do, remember, in Act 2. And then in Act 3, we realize, oh, there's this whole thing going down. John Proctor, as the protagonist of our play, is going to engage in a tragic fall. Now, two things about that fall. One, Aristotle said that that fall is most usually associated with some flaw in the character. Now, usually for Aristotle, this is what we call hubris, or sometimes translated as excessive pride. Okay? Well, the point I want to make here is that there's any number of reasons why The Crucible is a classic work of literature and drama. One of the reasons is that Arthur Miller clearly has in mind what Aristotle was saying long before Christ was born. Okay, you can roughly say 400 years before Christ is born. So clearly a long time before 1950, because that's 1,950 years after the birth of Christ. You got me? Right? That's when his play is actually written. But Miller is reaching way back, far further back than Salem. And he's saying, let me tell you a story that does the very thing Aristotle said good drama does. What is it that good drama does? Watch it. As the fall of the protagonist happens, the audience identifies with the fall through a process called catharsis, or sometimes translated as purgation. Catharsis or purgation. Purge is our word from purgation. To purge. Okay? Catharsis simply means the following. As the audience is watching the fall of the protagonist, it begins to identify with that protagonist and his fall. In what ways? Through two powerful emotions. Fear and pity. Or what we might translate as sympathy. Okay? Fear and pity. Well, now, what's that all about? Aristotle says that while we have a tendency to look on the stage and say, oh, there's the play. That's the play that's going on. That's the drama that's going on. Maybe the way we would say it for our notes is, Aristotle said the play is what happens on stage. The drama is what happens in the audience. And the drama is way more important than what happens on the stage. Although they're clearly symbiotic. They go together. So the audience goes through a process of catharsis or purgation, where the audience feels two powerful emotions while this play is going on stage. The first, let's talk about both of them. The first is fear. Well, what's fear all about? Fear is all about watching the protagonist go through a situation in many ways of his own creation. Think John Proctor here, and we go, whoa. I mean, he did this to himself. Let's say it out loud, right? And we kind of look at it and go, oh man, it would stink to be in that situation. Whoo. Right? This is a level 3 observation, isn't it? When we relate to the text ourselves at 3b, and we go, man, that would stink. You screw up once. You sleep with the young girl when you're married and you have kids. But then the girl says, oh no, not so fast. You don't get to throw me out the house. I got a way to get you back. The way I'm going to get you back is I'm going to jack your wife. And Proctor has a dilemma on his hand. He can pull the plug at any time. That's the point of what Elizabeth tells him in Act 2. You need to go to Salem and you need to just say it out loud. Abigail Williams, she's trying to manipulate you. I'm going to deal. You got to deal with this. He's like, man, I just don't. Caught in two minds. I just don't know. I just don't know. And the audience has an ability to look at the protagonist and go, oh man, that would totally stink to be in that guy's situation. There's no easy answer, right? Now, some of you will say, what are you talking about? There's a simple, easy answer. The easy answer is he goes to Salem, he stands up in front of everybody, he says, I slept with this girl, I'm going to kill my reputation doing this, but I slept with this girl, my wife found out, she threw her out, that's the end of it. This witchcraft crap is all crap. That's all that it is. And I know that because Abigail Williams confided as much to me just a few days ago. Done. Done. The very fact in Act 3 that this suggestion is made, and Danforth says it out loud. If it were for lechery, that is to say sleeping with somebody not your husband, he says it to Abigail. If it were for lechery, you're gone. You're done. In other words, we realize in the third act, Proctor could have solved all of this by simply going forward and confessing. But he doesn't do it. But the audience has a hard time. Because we go, dude, I've been in situations before where I did something and I didn't want to admit it. So I just kind of stayed silent. I mean, from the time we were young, who broke the lamp? If I tell, I get jacked. If I don't tell, maybe I can get away. I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to, right? And the adults in our life are all like, you need to tell the truth. And we're like, yeah, right. I know all about what happens when I tell the truth. I get jacked. I ain't telling no truth. See how that works? So we totally understand the situation of fear. Wait a minute. What's this thing about pity? This is a good one. What's this thing about pity? Because Aristotle says if a work of literature works at all, it works because the audience begins to identify and feel sympathy for the protagonist. Sympathy. Now, think about that. We have this word sympathy, to sympathize. That means to put yourself in another person's place. Right? By the way, let's just step out of that definition for a moment and recognize the difference between sympathy and empathy. Empathy is, I've been through the same situation, I know where you're at. Sympathy is, I ain't never been through that exact situation, but dude, I can totally feel for what you're going through right now. It's the kind of thing friends do with each other, where they go, man, you're in a tight spot, this is tough for you. The audience begins to identify and feel pity for the protagonist. As we know, the protagonist is going down. This is crucial. Let's not overlook it. Aristotle says that the play is what's happening on stage. The drama is what's happening in the audience. As the audience starts to go, oh, dude, there's no way this guy's getting out alive, is there? No, there is not. Oh, man. Well, that just stinks. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because in our own lives, all of us can identify a moment when you are stuck in moral crisis in the middle of the heating up of the bowl, the crucible. And you go, well, ain't no easy way out. No, there is not. Well, I guess I could. No, you won't. Well, I think I could. No, you won't. Oh. Well, poop. Yes, that's right. That is right. What you just said is absolutely right. And all of us kind of can know what that feels like, so that as the protagonist falls, and it's inevitably coming, the audience begins to have this powerful emotion of fear, this powerful emotion of pity, and they start to go together. And this is the essence. Are you ready for this? For Aristotle? This is the essence of what's different between you and your dog. Whoa, what we just said is profound. Now, we've had that throwaway line that the difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. That's Aristotle. That's Aristotle. In other words, the difference between you and your dog is both of you can look at the sun going down, the sunset. Only one of you can appreciate the beauty of it and go, oh, that's stunning. Aristotle says that's what makes us human. Beyond normal animals, because we have this capacity to feel another's pain. We have this capacity to kind of watch what's happening as the protagonist falls and somehow identify with that fall. Now, watch this to finish. Aristotle says in Poetics, and by the way, in his classic text, and We'll talk about this more later in your senior year. But in his classic text, he says the greatest playwright was Sophocles, and the greatest play of all time was a play called Oedipus Rex, King Oedipus. And the story of Oedipus, who kills his dad and marries his mom and has 4 kids with his mom and all of that. We'll get into that story later. But Aristotle said the following: the greatest plays, the greatest texts, are the ones that elicit the most fear and pity out of the audience. That's the greatest texts. See, this is an interesting question. Make the quick list of the 3 most important movies you've ever watched. Best movies you've ever watched. 3. The ones that not only you've watched once, not only you've watched twice, but way more than that. You've gone back. You've watched it again. If we wanted to speak in academic language, you've studied those texts. You know those texts. Ask a simple question. In all 3 of those texts, do you have any kind of capacity to identify with the protagonist that's going to get jacked? And is that why you cry, even though you know it's happening? It's, you know, you're not shocked. You're not like, oh, dude, I wonder what's going to happen in this movie to that person. No. You've watched the movie before. Well, then how come you cry? Aristotle says, how come you cry? Why? Dude. Because I'm sad. What are you talking about? Why do I cry? Because it's sad. Why is it sad? Because I start to identify with the character. And as the character goes down, I recognize in my own life, see, here's the drama in the audience. In my own life, I recognize I've been through this. I know all about this. In other words, Aristotle, see, now we can use our language. Remember, we define learning in 303 as the ability to connect new information to old information. We're about to do it. Watch this. So in other words, what we're saying is, the minute that you can identify or connect with John Proctor, with the dilemma that he has, the minute you can begin to appreciate, have some fear for, and some sympathy for a cat that is stuck in the middle and he cannot get out of it. The minute you can do that, we're talking about a great work of literature as it relates to Aristotle. Now, one of the other things that Aristotle said is understood in this game, right? In other words, what we call plot. Let's summarize that really quickly. Aristotle said that great works of literature have basically 3 movements, if we can speak in music language. Okay? We have a beginning, let's call it A. We have some kind of middle, let's call it B. And we have some kind of end, let's call it C. The beginning is the exposition, right? We got to have things like issues of character and setting and time. Notice how Act 1 plays that game for us, right? In our play Crucible. So, for example, we know who our primary characters are. Abigail Williams, John Proctor, Elizabeth Proctor. We've got a couple of religious people in Paris and Hale. And, of course, we're going to later, obviously, have Danforth and his project with Hawthorne. The judges, if you will. All right? And then, of course, you have some other characters as understood by the setting, which is Salem. And, of course, we're talking about a very particular time in Salem, right? In that really important period that we call the Salem witch trials. Okay? So that's the beginning. The rising action, right, is all defined by this thing called conflict or struggle. Correct? Where you're going to have 2 kinds of potential fights or struggles or conflict. You can have internal versus external. Correct? The external conflicts, character versus another character. We got that obviously with, for example, Abigail Williams and Goody Proctor, right? Character versus some kind of natural force. You could make the argument that the supernatural and the witchcraft element is playing games here. And then finally you can have character versus society or an idea of a kind, right? In other words, there's certain kinds of expectations. Like, for example, I actually had a junior that said this. This is stupid. Why doesn't Proctor just step up in front of the whole church and say, yeah, I slept with this girl named Abigail. Big deal. Dude, we hooked up. We were like, messing around in the stable, and that's what Proctor says. We did it where the animals are kept, in the stable, in a barn. Yeah, we were in a barn. Yeah, there was some hay. We like hooked up. That's it. It's over. Big deal. Everybody just get over it. Wait. We are talking about a much different time. Yes? Now, some of you will say, even today, that ain't so easy to just say that. People make judgments, for example, about who and what you are by virtue of what you do with your body sexually. Still today, some people make those decisions. In Puritan Salem, naughty. You're not allowed. So for Proctor to step up and say, I slept with this girl who wasn't my wife, and she was working for us. Right? Of course, even today, we still have that dilemma. You're free to do with your body what you want, but if you're in a position of power, you better be careful about sleeping with somebody who is underneath you in position of power. Right? In other words, your servant, that's kind of, even today, right? That's still kind of looked down. So John Proctor has an obvious problem. The conflict, of course, here is an internal one for Proctor, though. Let's be fair, right? In other words, do I give up the information? Do I not give up the information? Notice, we find out by the second act, we find out actually that two people know about John Proctor and Abigail. Obviously his wife. She's the one that got rid of Abigail. But we also find out Mary Warren knows. And John Proctor, remember, he's just like, what? Mary told you? Or Abigail told you? Mary goes, yeah, I've known for a while. Oh, well, that's it. I'm going forward. Dude, what changed? Well, Proctor sees a handwriting on the wall. If Mary Williams knows, then obviously other girls know. And if other girls know, then everybody in town's going to know. I might as well just go ahead and just do this thing. Which does beg the question, is that really legitimately the act of a courageous person, or just the act of a coward once it's kind of been discovered? You see, you can begin to debate. Of course, this rising action is what we'll think of as Act 2, won't we? If this is Act 1 of Crucible, this rising action is definitely Act 2. No question. Here now, in the second act, we've got the exchange between John Proctor and his wife. And she says, oh, you were alone with Abigail when she told you about this whole thing in the woods? Well, not for very long. You didn't tell me that. Woman! She's like,